Richard P. says, committed Christians are not always seen as good conversation partners, especially when talking about God. We as Christians need to relearn how to talk about our faith. We need to relearn how to have deep and meaningful conversations. There's some keys to having meaningful and deep, better Christian conversations. One of them is that it involves a give and take. Now that engages both partners in the conversation, not just the Christian in the conversation. Second, it deals with issues of consequence. Not just the mundane of day in, day out, but the really deep stuff in life. It's open-ended. There isn't a prescribed place where this conversation is trying to get to. It deepens friendships. Rather than driving people apart, it changes people. In fact, deep conversation results in conversion on both parties, the person you're talking to and on you. Now, this is a far cry from what Christians tend to think of when they hear the terms witness or evangelism. This is, I tell you the story of my conversion in 3 minutes or less, basically an elevator speech. I give you a brief presentation of the gospel with a chart included, and at the end, well, there's a call to commitment. A challenge to accept Christ here and now, right this second. Do it. We're starting a new series today called Holy Conversations based on a book called Holy Conversation by Richard Peace. He's a professor of evangelism and spiritual formation at Fuller Seminary. And we're going to spend 4 weeks on talking about sharing our faith, about, well, really learning how to become good Christian conversationalists, to have better Christian conversations, to be good Christian conversation partners. Richard Peace says, what had once been the glorious art of Christian conversation has been reduced down to a kind of telemarketing campaign for Jesus. You can think of this 4-week series as a training course in holy conversation. And it's an opportunity for you to experience the gospel yourself. I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of Holy Conversation in the micro bookstore. Yes, we're reclaiming the micro bookstore after a long hiatus during COVID. And find a conversation partner outside of the church. Someone who maybe considers themselves a Christian or not. Now, leading up to this series and through it, I've found a conversation partner and a family member, my niece, Hannah. In fact, she was the one who started the conversation with me. You see, she's a student at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And she reached out to me because she wanted to interview me for a class. The class was titled Religious Diversity in the United States. And she wanted to see how things worked for me when it came, especially to some of the big issues of the day around gender and sexuality and race and so on. And we had a wonderful, deep conversation for about an hour on Zoom. It was deep. It was a spiritual conversation. It was a holy conversation, a meaningful conversation. Now we're going to be practicing this sort of conversation here through this series, especially in the chat. So if you are somebody who doesn't usually engage in the chat, if you're somebody who just watches this at home, we know you're out there, you're watching it on your big screen TV in your living room, and you don't usually have Facebook open, get your phone out, open up Facebook or YouTube and chat along with us. I mean, that's what this whole series is about. It's about having holy conversations. So we have a conversation starter right here off the bat for you. Let's talk about this in the chat, or if you're in the studio, turn to the person next to you and answer this question. What's been your experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with having conversations about God? Let's talk about that. Christians don't have a great reputation of being good conversation partners. And one of the reasons is that we really have stopped listening to those people around us. We've stopped listening for and looking for the deep longings in people. We need to start our reclaiming of being better conversation partners by first listening for the deep longings. Our conversation needs to focus first on the particular issues that each person brings when it comes to the way that they think and experience God. Every person that we meet is on a spiritual pilgrimage. No one is the enemy. We too are on a spiritual pilgrimage. Richard Peace puts it this way: there is an inner restlessness until we pay attention to our spiritual side. There are all kinds of different people out there, and each one has a unique longing or a unique set of questions that they're asking about life, about God. Take the agnostic, for example. The agnostic is someone who's not sure whether there is a God or not. And they have a key question: how can I know if there is a God? Or take the atheist. The atheist is someone who does not believe that God exists. And their key question is there a God? Or take the deist, for example. The deist is someone who believes that God is an impersonal force. And their primary question is God personal? Or the intellectual believer. Now, the intellectual believer is someone who believes in God, but who is not committed to God. And they want to ask the question, what does God demand of me? Then there's the seeker. This is someone who wants to know God. And their key question is, how can I know God? Then there are people who are indifferent. This is someone who has ceased caring about the issue of God. Their key question in life is, what is the meaning of life? Or the contented. The contented is the person who has it all and doesn't need God. And they ask the question, when disaster strikes, how do I deal with this without a God? Then there's the disillusioned. And this is someone who once believed but has lost faith. They find themselves asking the question, what went wrong with my religious experience? Now, in a lot of ways, this person is Sycamore Creek's wheelhouse. We connect with a lot of people who find themselves disillusioned with faith or with the church. And lastly, there's the relativist. The relativist is someone who believes it doesn't matter what you believe. But then when faced with the great evils of our history and world like the Holocaust, find themselves asking the question, how do I deal with such a thing as this force of evil like the Holocaust? Now that's a list just to give you a kind of sense of the landscape out there. But there are probably as many kinds of longings as there are people in the world, as many kinds of questions about who God is as there are people that you know. Now remember, the whole point of this is because Christians don't have a great reputation in being conversation partners, we have got to start by listening to the longings, the deep needs of where people are at, the particular issues in their life when it comes to the question of God. So here's a question for you. Again, we want to encourage you not just watch online, but really engage. Practice this conversation in the chat section. And do it in the chat section or talk to the person next to you. Here's our question for conversation. What deep longings do you see in yourself and the people around you? Let's talk about that. Now, to be good conversation partners, we first start by listening and engaging people where they're at, with their particular issues, their particular longings, their particular needs. And then we tell stories. Richard Peace says, become a storyteller. This is what brings holy conversation alive. So if we want to become good conversation partners, we're going to have to learn how to tell good stories. How do we tell stories about our experience with God, about who Jesus is, and about what the good news, the gospel is? Let's start first with how we tell good stories about our experience with God. The one personal story that many Christians have learned to tell is the story of their conversion. Now that's a really powerful story. It's a really important story. But if we're going to be good storytellers about our experience of God, it has to be telling stories about our experience of God that are present, about God being with us and how we engage God and experience God and hear God or don't. Right now, yesterday, the last week, a month ago, right here in our everyday. For example, very early in the pandemic, I was supposed to be leading an in-person spiritual retreat up at a quiet retreat center in DeWitt called the St. Francis Center. In fact, I lead one almost every semester. You can sign up at sycamorecreekchurch.org/small groups. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we couldn't meet in person. So it was happening, well, right here online in my office, except that it wasn't quiet like it is now. I mean, my kids are back to school. Back then, my kids were in online school, and there was all kinds of noise in the house. And I remember sitting here in my room getting more and more frustrated, trying to listen in silence for God's voice, for God's presence, and feeling like if only my kids would be quiet, then I could hear God. And it was right at that biggest moment of frustration that God broke through the clutter of the noise and said to me, now you will learn how to listen to me not in a quiet retreat center, but in the noise of your home. That was such a profound experience of God to me. Now, I didn't hear God quite so directly the rest of the day, but in that moment, God's presence was undeniable to me in the midst of the noise of my house. Sometimes we focus too much on people's belief about God and not enough on what's their experience of God. And they might not even use the word God, but of awe of something bigger than themselves. Richard Peace says this: ask them about God, not so much about what they think about God, as about the experiences of God they might have had. So here's a question for you. Again, we want to encourage you, don't just watch online at home. Engage in the chat with this question, or turn to the person next to you and answer this question. What recent experiences of God do you have? Let's talk about that. Now, if you don't have a lot of personal experiences of God lately, don't get too anxious about it. One of the beautiful things about being part of a community is that we experience God together. We experience God through each other and through each other's experiences of God. So we've been talking about how we become good storytellers, about our experiences with God, but how do we tell stories about who Jesus is? I mean, right off the bat, who is Jesus? Perhaps our chief challenge in having holy conversations or deep conversations about who Jesus is to get past the stereotypes and the shallow understandings and misunderstandings that people in our culture have of who Jesus is. I think one of the ways that we do this is we just simply paraphrase and put into our own words the gospel stories, the stories from the Bible that we know of Jesus. I think about one story of a father who brought his son to be healed by Jesus. And he says to Jesus, if you can, will you heal him? And Jesus says, if I can, everything is possible for him who believes. And the father says, I believe, help my unbelief. Now that phrase is a phrase that I have hooked onto so many times in my experience of who Jesus is. I believe, help my unbelief. And you might think that Jesus would turn him away and say, hey, listen, come back when you got full 100% certainty, no doubt. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus turns to the son and heals him. Now, the mercy that Jesus shows this father and this son in the midst of his doubt and unbelief, in the midst of his being genuine with Jesus, is so impressive to me. That's a way that I encounter Jesus on a regular basis. Just being genuine and honest about the questions I have, the things I'm still curious about, the things that I'm not sure I believe. Or take the story of who Jesus picks to be his closest followers. I mean, he's got a Roman sellout in Matthew, the tax collector. This is a guy who goes along to get along. And then he's got Judas, the one who betrays him, and Simon the zealot, who both think violence is an acceptable means to a political or religious end. I mean, talking about the tension between those two different groups of people. But not only are there guys in Jesus' closest followers, there's Mary and Martha and Lydia. I mean, these are amazing followers of Jesus. The diversity in Jesus' followers always is compelling to me. Then there's the story of the woman who is caught in adultery. Now, this is always an interesting story to me because how do you catch just the woman in adultery? I mean, where's the guy at? It takes two to tango. But somehow they bring only the woman, and Jesus kneels down in the midst of this angry crowd, and he starts to draw in the sand, to write in the sand. This is the only example we have in the whole Bible of Jesus writing. And slowly, the people start to fade away. The story goes that the oldest fade away first, and then the youngest. Nobody really knows what Jesus was writing, but maybe he was writing their particular sins in the sand at his feet. Eventually, there's nobody there. Jesus looks at the woman and says, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she says, "They've all gone away." And he says, "Well, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." I mean, the way that Jesus holds together mercy and truth, grace and love, kindness, and also this sort of prophetic presence to the crowd, it just amazes me. These are the stories of who Jesus is. And that's only 3 that I've told. Now, I think what comes to the surface for me about who Jesus is in these stories is that Jesus is the love of God in the flesh. But he's not just, let's say, an ethical guy or the most ethical guy or a great moral teacher. No, there's something entirely unique about who Jesus is, entirely unique in the entire history of the whole world, in the entire history of humanity. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, also wrote a defense of the Christian faith called Mere Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, he has this interesting way of talking about who Jesus is. He writes, "I am here trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." Lewis says, this is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice, Lewis says. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. This defense that C.S. Lewis presents of who Jesus was sometimes is summarized as liar, lunatic, or Lord. Jesus either lied about who he was a lunatic who thought that he could forgive people's sins, or he really was Lord, really was God in the flesh. So we have another opportunity for you to practice chatting about who Jesus is in the chat section, in the comments. Don't just watch at home on your big screen TV. Get out your phone, your laptop, comment along with us, or turn to the person next to you in the studio and answer this question. What are 1 or 2 of your favorite stories about Jesus in the Bible? And how would you put those stories into your own words? Let's talk about that. All right, so far we've talked about telling stories about our experience with God, about who Jesus is. And lastly, we got to learn how to tell stories about what the good news is. Here's the key question. How would you describe the good news, sometimes called the gospel, of Jesus? Richard Peace says, when we talk about the gospel, we need to do so in the words that compute for other people. In the end, it doesn't matter what you say, it only matters what's heard. What he's basically saying here is that we need to understand theological and biblical terms so deep that we can translate them on the fly into the unique vocabulary, into the unique way that people talk around us, into the unique moment that you are in right then and there. It's not just enough to tell stories about our experience of God. That's the subjective side of faith. We've got to learn how to tell stories about the objective side of our faith, who Jesus is and what the good news of Jesus is. Now, here's a simple way to think about this. Jesus plus people plus commitment equals the gospel. Today, we're talking about the Jesus part of that equation. who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. Next week, we're going to talk about the people side of that equation. And towards the end of this series, we're going to talk about the commitment side. Now, we've already talked about who Jesus is, but what has Jesus done? Now, here's the way that I put it in sort of short, easy, everyday language. Jesus united the divine and the human so that humanity might be united with the divine. We have a cross at our South Lansing campus, and on that cross it has 3 words on each arm. One word says freedom. In Jesus, we've gained freedom from our bondage. One other arm says forgiven. In Jesus, our guilt has been forgiven. And another arm of the cross says healing. In Jesus, we are healed from the disease of sin. In Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, we experience forgiveness, healing, and freedom. Not pie in the sky when we die, but right here, right now. Life-changing, life-transforming grace and love of God. So let's go back to what a meaningful or holy conversation is all about. A vocabulary that communicates, plus an awareness of God's presence, plus a willingness to talk about God, equals holy conversations. So pick up a copy of Holy Conversations in the micro bookstore and find a conversation partner, somebody who's not connected to a church, and have a deep, meaningful, holy conversation. Now, I told you that I was doing this myself with my niece, Hannah, and it started when she approached me about interviewing me. And I don't usually video record these sorts of conversations, but she was recording it because she wanted to be able to reference it back for the paper that she was writing. And at the very end of the conversation, the very end of the interview, she asked me a really, really important question. And I want to show you the last little bit of that conversation. And it's a very unscripted, very unperfect, very not sermon-like conversation, but it's real, it's genuine, it's authentic, and it happened right here, right here where you and me are at. And there's a couple of things that I want you to listen for as you hear me answering her question. Watch for longings, watch for experiences of God, watch for who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, and watch for the way that I try to translate that into her everyday life. Now, by the way, she told me that right after this conversation, this interview, she was going out on a date with a guy for the 4th time. Watch and listen.
What do you think are the most important values you hold yourself to or see as important as being a religious leader in your community?
Mm-hmm. So to me, the fundamental value or truth is that God is love, and that means that inside of who God is, there exists this community. You can't have love but if it's just you have to have another person in that to say that you're loved. So what does it mean to say God is love? Well, the way Christians have understood it, that means that God is inside God's very being, one God in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That the gendered language there trips some people up. So some people say creator, redeemer, sustainer. I kind of like the old language, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But it's not a hill I die on. But you have a mutual loving relationship that exists inside the unity. There's a unity and a diversity, and that Jesus is the Son become a human being so that humans might be invited into that loving relationship too. And I desire as a religious leader
to remove all of the obstacles that keep people or trip people up from accepting that invitation into the love of God. That they are loved by God, that they are welcomed by God, that they are, you can't do anything to make yourself more beloved. You're going on this date this afternoon and you're probably thinking like, if you like this guy, you're like, how can I like make myself more attractive to this dude? Like, that's not how it works with God. Like, you are already as attractive as you ever can be. There's not anything that you do that like keeps you from God loving every bit of you. And the thing is, like, that God being God knows more of you than like God knows who we are. Like, and that's scary. And yet God loves us. Like, that's, that I've been married coming up on 25 years. And that marriage is like the closest approximation that I have in this world to somebody knowing me like everything. But even still, like, there's no way Sarah can get in my head and know all of my thoughts. And sometimes I think if she did, I wonder, would she still love me? But I don't think you have to ask that question with God. God already knows your thoughts. God already knew all of the mess and brokenness and self-centeredness, and loved you enough to go on a rescue mission into this world that ultimately ended in his death, in Jesus' death. And so all of these issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is, those all just become like obstacles for people hearing that basic truth.
That's hard for me to watch myself when I'm not all put together and have an outline and a script like I am right now. But whatever you heard in that conversation, whatever you got out of it, I got some immediate feedback, because what I didn't know is that the guy she was going out on a date with was actually just off screen. And he'd been listening in on the conversation, and he came in at the very end and he complimented me. He complimented me on how articulate I was and how well I put all of this whole stuff into words. It was pretty amazing for me to hear him say all that. What I was really trying to do was just describe the good news of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So again, in the chat section, or turn to the person next to you, answer this question. How would you describe the good news of the gospel in your own words? Let's talk about that.